Good evening, everyone. My name's Olivia Robinson. I work in Queensland Memory here at the State Library. So delightful to see so many people here tonight for the first of our new monthly talk series called A Night in the JOL. We're really excited to be able to bring to you a whole series of talks over the next few months. I think from March right through to October this year. So be sure to get on our mailing list and come along throughout the year as well. We're really thrilled, before I go any further, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and also to say how grateful we are that Kate Evans is able to host the A Night in the JOL talk series this year. And how delighted we are to have Ross and Helen and Diane as well here talking this evening to you. And of course to have so many collection items out so you get to enjoy them and explore them after the talk as well. So I'll hand over to Kate who'll take you through the evening.
Thank you very much, Olivia. And it goes without saying that we really wouldn't like you to throw any red wine over any of these collections. And also, if you wouldn't mind checking that you've turned your mobile phone off, although if you decide to, tweet elegant comments, please feel free to do so. So welcome again to the first in this series of Nights at the JOL. This is an opportunity to hear from specialist librarians and curators, historians and researchers, and to get a glimpse into the huge collection here at the JOL. And tonight, as you know, we're leaping off from the exhibition Grass Dukes and Shepherd Kings, which I know most of you have already seen and indeed just had a special guided tour of. But the challenge for every curator and historian is what they leave out. For every photo and letter on display in that exhibition, many more were examined. Most of the items come from larger collections that help make sense of the one that was chosen. And of course, there were also many that might have been used to tell a different story altogether. So I wonder, what story would you tell? Would you tell the story of failed land claims or stock riders, domestic workers or soldiers, itinerant labourers, or of how mail was delivered? And after hearing Diane speak, I thought, what's the history of taxidermy in Queensland, I wonder? So I'd hazard that you could tell all of those stories too if you had time to delve into the collection, because that's the pleasure of research. But instead, tonight we're joined by three historians who can draw out some of the stories already embedded in the exhibition. Stories of the environmental and pastoral history of the Darling Downs, the politics of this part of Australia, and the connections back to both New South Wales and to Empire. Stories of exclusivity and bloodlines, as well as stories of working with animals, breeding horses, racing them. Because a collection like this one, selected so carefully by curator Diane Byrne for the exhibition, reaches right into the depths of this building for many other stories. So please welcome tonight Helen Coughlan, co-author of A History of the Queensland Turf Club, who's also chair of the Thoroughbred Racing History Association. She is, of course, an expert in the history of horse racing, not just in Queensland, but in Australia. And also with us is Ross Johnston, who taught history at the University of Queensland for many decades, with a specialisation that ranges from environmental and world history to the settlement history of Queensland. And indeed, I'm holding one of his books in my hand right now. And both Helen and Ross wanted it known that they consider themselves amateur enthusiasts, which hardly does them justice. And also with us is Diane Byrne, specialist librarian and curator of the Grass Dukes and Shepherd Kings. So please thank all three of them for joining us tonight. And what we're going to do in this conversation is move back and forth between all three of them as a way to draw out the themes of the exhibitions and to talk about some of the other histories and stories that we might be interested in. But Helen, can we start with a personal connection? The Guy Homestead, which featured in the exhibition, that's one you knew from childhood, isn't it?
I did, yes. I grew up on the Darling Downs. My grandmother was actually born on Glengallon Station, but that's another aspect. So, Kate, I remember Glengallon when it was a ruin, when the only thing that was holding up was the Glengallon Rose that used to hold up the pillars on the veranda. So it's wonderful to see Glengallon restored to its former glory, and I believe the Glengallon people have done a wonderful job. Talguy, when I was growing up in Allora on the Darling Downs, a lot of our school holidays were spent, as you did with a country kid, with ponies, disappearing for the day on a horse, and nobody seemed to sort of worry too much. You were okay. You came back at night when it was time for tea. But we spent a lot of time on Talguy. At that stage, it was owned by the Bardwells, by Berry and Alice Bardwell. And this is a question I want to pose to you tonight, because Talguy was a wonderful property. A lot of it wasn't used at that time. I can remember Berry Bardwell had a wonderful thoroughbred stallion called Assegai, that there was an orchard with the most marvellous kumquats and oranges and things. The horse used to stay in there. We'd wander along these big low set verandas there, and this horse would come flying out of the shrubbery, mouth open, ears back straight, and we'd run screaming down the veranda and lock ourselves in one of these disused rooms until Berry came and rescued us. But Talguy was interesting because as kids, as I said, we ranged all over the property. We spent so much time there, but we were always back in time for tea. And Alice was Irish. Very Irish. She had the wonderful Irish red hair, and she was a wonderful pianist. She had a fabulous piano there, and she used to play by ear. Any tune that you wanted, you just had to give her a start and she could play it. She was fantastic. There was a big polished table in the main room at Talguy. As kids, we were always to set the table. We set the table always for whoever was there, and on her instruction, we always set a place for the unseen guest. Now, the unseen guest, Alice believed, and she told us quite confidently, that it was a lady that she had seen, that she was on very good terms with, and she described her as standing at the top of the stairs, going down to what were the cellars in the property, just with her hand on the railing, dressed in a grey, soft, shiny type material. We had a perfect description of this lady. We, as kids, never saw her, but Alice was quite confident that she was there, and we never felt threatened. I mean, she was benevolent. It was fine. So that was our experience of Talguy and the unseen guest. Many years later, and not that long ago really, Talguy became a bed and breakfast, and you could go out there and have a wonderful meal. And I spoke to the owner, who was the chief chef, and I said to him, because he was talking about his guests for bed and breakfast, and I said, "Do you still set a place for the unseen guest?" Of course, he looked at me. Never heard of it. So I said to him, "Oh yes, well, this is what we used to do." I told him the story, and he said, "Well, we wouldn't want anybody," and I just didn't comment of who this person was. I just said that we believed that there was a ghost. And he said, "Well, they wouldn't be banging pots and pans around my kitchen." And that was the end of the discussion. When we were going out to the car later, the young lass that was waiting on the table came running after us. And she said, "I heard you talking about the unseen guest." She said, "I've seen a lady." And I said, "Have you?" And she said, "Yes." She said, "She stands at the top of the stairs going down to the cellar, and she has a grey dress." She described that person as we had been told as children. Now, I'm asking you, and I don't know, we were just talking before about the dress that this lady wore. I'm not been able to pinpoint where she fits into the picture. Who she was obviously quite well-to-do, because apparently she was well-dressed. I would like to know if anybody has got any thoughts on the age or the history of Talguy, that we could actually pinpoint who this lady was. I know Ross was saying, when you're talking about the Irish people and they're a bit fey with the little people and that sort of thing, maybe this was a story that just got better with the telling. But I thought it was really interesting that this young lass told us the same story.
Well, that's where I'm going to leap in with a slightly different way of responding to it, I guess, because I'm a big believer in history and not at all of spiritual phenomenon, I'll admit. And so, Ross Johnston, as a cultural historian, I might ask you, I guess, about the way in which a place like the Darling Downs is haunted by its history. And in particular, it seems to me that the argument in the exhibition is that period from about the 1840s to the 1890s is in some ways a peculiar period in terms of, what was happening politically and economically. I mean, how significant is that period for understanding Queensland history?
Let me start sideways, because when Helen spoke, it was obvious she's a dinky-die Queenslander. So my first statement is a qualification. I am not. I, in fact, am a Mexican from south of the border, although it may be called disputed territory. I come from the Upper Clarence, which, if one of the progenitors of Queensland's history had had his way, the Reverend Dr. John Dunmore Lang, where I came from, which is Malangani, which none of you have heard of, but I'm not going to go through my little repartee because, Kate, I have a lot of Celtic superstitious background in me, so I might take issue with the way you approach history. But the Reverend Dr. John Dunmore Lang would have had my territory as part of the new colony of Queensland. But sad to say, the people of the 1840s, before there was a Queensland, because remember in the 1840s, all of us here are still governed from Sydney, not from Canberra, from Sydney. And it was only in 1859 that Queensland becomes a separate colony. And the ruling people, or some of the ruling people in the 1830s, 1840s, were big New England squatters. They'd been moving up from Sydney with their sheep in particular, rather than any other livestock. And they were occupying the New England tablelands and spreading out towards Moree and Bert and those sorts of areas. And also so it's only in 1840 that we get the start of the European occupation of Queensland apart from Brisbane, which was a convict colony in 1840, and there was an exclusion zone around Queensland that there really shouldn't be any white people going outside a 50 or an 80-kilometre, 50-mile limit from Brisbane. So when these New England squatters, ever expanding, it's a great expansive phase, a growth phase, just as much as the 1990s were in a sense. They were spilling down into my territory, Malangani, Tablum, the Upper Clarence, and at the very same time they begin spilling into the Darling Downs. So we've got this connection from Maitland. In fact, in the earliest period of our Darling Downs, the real connection from the Darling Downs is down to Maitland. That was the market where they could sell their stock, not Brisbane. Brisbane catches up later on. And just 2 weeks ago, I know this is an awfully rambling answer, so you've got to cut me off when you want to, because it's the Irish part in me. I can ramble on forever. 2 weeks ago, I took the train, the XPT, which is not very XPT, down to Sydney, and of course it still goes through Maitland. So we still, in fact, have that Queensland-Maitland connection. And indeed, it was only by 1846, I have one or two dates in my repertoire, only in 1846 that there was a fortnightly mail service from Brisbane to the Darling Downs. And by this stage, the Darling Downs was almost already all sopped up by squatters. So Brisbane is not the base for the early Darling Downs people. They are an overflow from New England, and so there may be a degree of similarity between New England and the Darling Downs, but then increasingly, and I'm sort of answering your question by now, increasingly they begin to divine their own sort of culture, their own way of living. And I guess one would say, but it's not unique in the Darling Downs. I think one would see this happening also in New South Wales and in Victoria. Probably in New South Wales, I'm thinking of the area in the Southern Highlands. That sort of an area, something quite similar is happening. I don't know my Victorian history all that well, but I expect it's out around Mount Macedon, going towards Nareen and Hamilton and those sorts of areas, would be developing this similar sort of merino aristocracy, based upon sheep, based upon huge extensive areas, but where the Queensland or the Darling Downs difference comes is environment. Environment does shape the way we behave and the way we think. We've got to adapt in a different way. We've got to try and figure out how to live in this environment, which is different from living on the Southern Highlands or living down at Mount Macedon. So slowly we're beginning to evolve our own sense of Queenslanderism, which I still don't have because I'm not from Queensland. No, I don't think I answered your question.
Well, you gave us quite a few things to talk about there, and I didn't mean to be. I wasn't being dismissive of your story, but rather trying to think of other ways into it, and to bring Diane into the story now. I mean, if we're talking about a later period in which a woman in a homestead on the Darling Downs is a significant enough figure that she haunts the storytelling, I mean, how much was this settlement on the Darling Downs something that was driven by the men who came here? I mean, how many women did we see, you know, in those homesteads, particularly in the early part of your period?
Well, I think the first thing that happened was once they managed to get up here and establish themselves, then they looked around and decided that they were going to get a wife. I think that's true of certainly the very first of the squatters. And, of course, they looked in many cases to Sydney for their wives. So you have someone like George Leslie going who was a great friend of the MacArthurs, marrying Emmeline MacArthur, bringing her up to Canning Downs and establishing her in their slab hut. You've got Arthur Hodgson finding his wife again. She was the daughter of the Chief Justice of New South Wales, so he'd known her down south. They were very well connected people, and they maintained those connections through their marriages. So I think certainly the wives were very important, and they were there early on, and they were the people that did perhaps transform the landscape. The squatters themselves had a view of their lives because often, in many cases, they were second sons or third sons of distinguished families back in England, but so they had a view of the way in which they would expect themselves to live. But I think their wives also shaped that quite clearly as well.
But one's got to say that there was a huge gender disparity, and especially in respect to population, because it's not only the squatters, it's all the shepherds. Now, hardly any of those were married. So there's a huge disparity between the number of women and their status and the number of men. But I would agree with Diane that these women are very much beginning to be the fomenters of a civilisation, a culture here.
It must have been a huge shock to them, though, to come from the
Isn't it-
society of Sydney to hit the...
It's very
that
true,
sort of,
but if you do read Katie Hume's reminiscences of her time on the Downs, she came from a manor house in England, and her husband was a surveyor. Ultimately, he became, I think it was Surveyor General of Queensland, wasn't it, Ross? But in his early years in the 1860s out here, they were a young married couple, so they established themselves in a fairly simple way, but they had a lot of expectations about what constituted the way they wanted to live and the way they expected other people to live too. And she's very clear and quite disparaging sometimes about her neighbours when they seem to be letting the side down in terms of their behaviour or their dress or their socialising, things of that kind.
And that's one of the entertaining things, I guess, about the exhibition is that sense of a class and hierarchy and which is also why the title is so funny, really, Grass Dukes and Shepherd Kings. But it also does allow us to be quite playful in this discussion, which is to say, you've got these bloodlines, you've got this obsession with breeding. What's the parallel then with the history of horses in Australia?
Well, I mean,
it sounds very horsey.
the emphasis was on breeding, be it man, woman, or horse. It's true. That was the attitude. You know, they had to be absolutely, perfectly, beautifully bred.
But it also meant, though, that horses stood for different things, didn't they? I mean, if we look at some of the items that are out here, and you look through the labour records, there are horse boys and there are people ploughing, and then there are also the stories of the women who are riding around in a slightly decorative way on their land. And then there are also photos showing that they're also working, they're also droving. So these horses aren't one thing either, are they?
Well, when they first came to Australia, the government decreed that the horses that came via the Cape of Good Hope and obviously by ship, imagine the voyage from England, had to be fit for draft. In other words, they had to be big, strong, heavy horses. So they were working horses initially. it took a while for the then for the ladies or the gentlemen to develop carriage horses, riding horses, that type of thing. But the squatters and the rich people developed their own horses. The thing that fascinates me is Elizabeth MacArthur, whom we talked about, writing in glowing terms of the 9 horses that they owned, and that would have been roughly when?
And
17...
Yes, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I think I've...
and they cost a fortune,
yeah,
didn't they?
They cost a fortune.
Worth...
1795, she wrote about these dozen horses, and she noted, and this is 1795, mind you, that a good horse was worth between 140 and 150 guineas.
You could get a shepherd for £50.
You could buy the whole country.
And Ross, I can see that there's something else you're busting to say, but the thing that strikes me, if I could just follow on from what Helen said, if there are government regulations about the type of horses that could be used and bred, surely this is also telling us something about how complicated the relationship to government and to a central government is in the 19th century in a place like, well, not quite Queensland yet.
Yes, well, I think that was true. And I think the influence of the development of the horse, as we said, fit for draft initially, was the influence of the rich people, the people who came from England, who could then afford to import the more elegant style of horses to suit their lifestyle. And then, of course, from that evolved the thoroughbred. And that then came, particularly in New South Wales, because as you pointed out, we were still very much part of New South Wales. Racing began at Hyde Park in Sydney. So the horse evolved. And then, of course, apart from being fit for draft, he had to work pretty hard because he then had to be the person or the animal that carried the squatters, the explorers, the soldiers. He worked very hard.
And there is a picture of a police horse over
yes,
there.
Exactly.
Which is where the expertise of different researchers come into it, because I have to confess I looked at it and just saw a picture of a horse. But down the bottom it said that it was a police horse named Brisbane that was presented to King George V, which I presume meant that it had a role with the state. But to me, to be honest, it was a picture of a horse. And there wasn't a whole lot more I could do with it, whereas you as a specialist researcher can take that story somewhere else.
Well, he was a big, strong horse, yes. And I would say we're not sure whether this particular horse was ever sent back to England. They did send a lot of horses back to... originally the horses came from Persia and later from England, but then later on there was a thriving export trade in horses going back to India for the Indian Army. So we're not sure whether this horse would have been sent back or whether it was a sort of a token presentation and he was used in ceremonial.
And there was a big horse training establishment for the police up at Rewan in the Springshore area. I knew I'd do that. Up in that area, whatever you call Springshore, the headwaters of the Fitzroy River, which operated for many decades. So it was probably bred there.
Possibly. And we were talking before about the development of the horses that went to the Boer War at the end of the pre-1900, once again. The development of the horse, the New South Wales whaler, as they called him, the big strong horse, that so many of the Australian horses that went to the Boer War and went to other theatres of war all over the world.
And speaking of expertise,
trivial interruption?
Well, it's not trivial, because I'm just going to say something else about your own work, Ross. We were talking about specialist historians. Ross's current work is on visual material. It's looking at painting, and of course the visual material in the exhibition there and in the collection here does range from photographs to painting to illustrations to maps. And so that sort of specialist knowledge in examining paintings is a very important part of looking at this history, but I'm not sure what you're holding.
Well, as I said, it's a trivial interruption, and this is sort of like an unpaid sponsorship. If you haven't bought this book already, you should do so. It's only $10, and it's by Mary Suter, wife of Richard Suter, the architect who designed East Talgai, and it's in Lyron's 1868 to 1885. And this illustration is up on the wall out there, but it was what we're talking about. Mary Suter has done this. You can't see it properly, so have a look out there. The Kangaroo Hunt, and that's what one does. You know, if you're of this pure merino establishment, you can go out here. The poor startled, dumb kangaroos just standing there waiting to be. And here are 3 men on their horses. And then we have 2 ladies. The ladies' view from the comfort of their carriage over here. So we've got a good sort of encapsulation of horses
And the lifestyle.
social life.
And it's interesting when they talk about their kangaroo hunts, because all through the 19th century histories that we have, and we've got a selection of them on the table there, Kate, they talk about the activities, the social activities, one of which outstandingly was the kangaroo hunt. And I've forgotten which author talks about it now, but he says, he gives a rundown on how it's done. And he said, and the pursuit of the hated marsupial.
Yeah.
And I think this is a sign of Queenslandism that you probably wouldn't get so much down in the Southern Highlands or at Mount Macedon.
And I'll just get you to move your microphone back just a little bit, just so to make sure everybody can hear you, and because we are recording this for the podcast. But I should also say, and I'm not sure how many, I know some of you in the audience were here last week, but Bill Gamage was here and spoke about his terrific historical study, The Biggest Estate, in which he talks about the Aboriginal shaping of the land over millennia. And part of that relates to our sense of pasture and of grasslands. He actually makes a case that there should be a statue put to kangaroo grass, because he reckons rather than on the sheep's back, that the wealth, particularly the early wealth and development of Australia, was on the back of grasslands. But he's sort of made me look at historical records in a different way. And wherever you see what looks a bit like a golf course, there's a very good chance that it was a shaped landscape to attract kangaroos. So that kangaroo hunt is possibly also a story of an Aboriginal impact on the Darling Downs as well.
And can I say, one needs to look at this Darling Downs story in 3 phases, really, or this is the way I do it. In fact, I found a new word, I think it's prosopography. So this is the whatever the adjective is.
Oh, we're not even going to try.
Approach towards land usage. 3 stages. One is Aboriginal land usage. We now accept that Aborigines were, or Indigenous people were, using the land with their fire stick farming, with other forms of land husbandry. Then the second stage is when we get to white occupation, and the first stage, there are 2 phases to white occupation. The first is this pastoralism phase, broad, extensive usage of the pasture lands that, in a sense, the Aborigines had created through their fire stick burning. Lovely and often some of the early accounts will talk of these almost park-like, and the Darling Downs certainly represented that, park-like environment. But through the 19th century, from the 1840s on, which is our period, through to the end of the century, we have an increasing, insistent third phase beginning to be expressed and to emerge and to finally dominate, and it's intensification of the use of the land, or agriculture, farming, cropping. But the governments themselves quite clearly had in their mind that there were these phases of civilisation, if you want to call it in that sense, and that the pastoralists are the first people to come in and begin to civilise or tame the land by using it fairly broadly, not interfering all that much with the environment, and then along come the farmers and the croppers who farm so intensively that we get much more environmental interference, and that's the third phase. But the thinking, the prevalent thinking amongst the government and the population at large was that this third stage was in fact a more noble stage of life. Hard, industrious workers. And he's not my hero, but I keep referring to him a lot, the Reverend Dr. John Dunmore Lang. He had an ideal for Queensland and for the whole of the world, where there would be lots of small, independently minded, liberally minded farmers tilling the ground, being virtuous, being abstemious, and also townspeople as professionals or as tradespeople. They would be working hand in hand. That was the image that in the long run we were supposedly going to move towards, and in fact we more or less have done so. But these are the 3 stages of whatever I said it was.
But Diane, just hearing that, there's a certain type of visionary image of how the land and the economy might work, but then of course you always have people who go out on their own limb. And so Hodgson, for example, he had his own almost colonial vision, didn't he? Which included wanting, convict labour back so that he could work the land. Is that right?
Yes, I don't think he was alone in that respect. I think it was something that the squatters all thought would be a very good idea to do this, to have a source of labour from convicts, the availability of convicts. So it was definitely part of their expectations and their aims as part of the ruling class, and certainly they advocated that in Parliament, where so many of them sat.
But this was well and truly after.
Oh, this
the
is
end.
Well, this is well and truly after, but this is in the 1850s, 1860s, when the convicts were no longer here in any kind of way in Queensland. But it wasn't that long since it had been it had only been closed down early in the beginning of the 1840s. So it was something that they thought would be a good idea to resume.
I think too they worked very hard at recreating, particularly with the horse industry, recreating the history and the traditions of Old England, because racing was obviously an integral part of the British or the English way, and so the squatters really drove that image, and they really developed their racing from those earliest days. The early racing in Queensland, in particular, gentleman riders, that sort of thing. It only became a sport of the people much later on, and it was always based, to promote the horses and the squattocracy.
And Helen, you saw that in some of the actual stables, I believe.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I think.
Well, I was just going to say that I know that Arthur was sent back to his vicar father in Rickmansworth in Hertfordshire for some men to be sent out. And one of them was killed by an Aboriginal, wasn't he, John Hill? I managed to find his tomb up in Toowoomba Cemetery recently, I found that very moving. I just wanted to say a little bit about, think of the clothes that they were wearing. These English women or Vivian Sydney, I've got photographs of them, absolutely amazing. Of course, they were wearing the same clothes in India in the heat too, so they're quite used to it. Quite a connection between India, I think, and Australia. I know that some of the Dowling children were sent to India to be educated in Calcutta. And I'll just tell you about...
I'll just leap in case people don't know. So Jandi is family is one of the families featured in the exhibition.
My great-grandfather was Arthur Hodgson.
Sorry, can we just pass the handheld microphone to you, just to make sure, in case people can't hear, and it's also useful for us to record this.
So
could you introduce yourself for us?
My name's Jandi Spurway, and he was my great-grandfather. So he was my mother's grandfather. And so he left quite early, really, having made a real pile, I think. And he bought the manor house for Stratford-on-Avon, and he continued his sort of civic life in Stratford, because he was 5 times mayor of Stratford. And eventually he was made Sir Arthur Hodgson. And there was a novel writer called Mary Corelli who lived in Stratford-on-Avon, and she ruefully said that his KCMG stood for King of the Colonial Mutton Growers.
Can I add to that, Diane, that wonderful story about dropping the G?
Yes, and now that's one that Jandi told us as well, because when he was out here in Queensland, he referred to himself as Hodgson, and the G was dropped because what was it again? It's that people said, "How do you pronounce it?" And he said, "Well, it's Hodgson, as in the G is silent, as in horse racing." So,
but also, a prominent family here who made money and then returned to England. I guess it also tells us something, and I know this is an area of interest to you, Ross, is that whole seeing 19th century Australian history as part of the imperial story. Most
of these young men who came out here, like Hodgson, if I get it correctly, or Henry Stuart Russell, they didn't. Their initial impulse was only to be here very briefly, and as Janice said, to make a pile of money and go back home. And this is where, in a sense, the home idea is very strongly promoted. And many of them did go home. Not too many of them stayed. And it is very much a case of a few English and a disproportionate number of Scottish people coming out here, few Irish. I regret to say I can't find a Welsh person amongst them, but there must be one somewhere or other. Later on, a German or two. But what you've got to remember is how the technology has changed, even in that 19th century. I know today we talk about very rapidly changing technology, but back then when you're a rural person using the land, in the 1840s you're a sheep owner and herder, you need a lot of labour, you need a lot of shepherds. And they weren't fencing initially, and they had to get in labour from somewhere or other. So it is not surprising that a person like Arthur, before he became Sir Arthur Hodgson, says, yeah, I want the revival of transportation or exiles or some form of getting in cheap labour. Sometimes we brought in bonded Asiatic labour in this period, the 1840s and the 1850s, except until 1851 when some Chinese bonded labourers did a strike up at Jandarian Station. Later on, by the 1860s, we're then bringing in Melanesians for the first real successful attempt we'd made at agriculture, tropical agriculture, sugar. We had started in the as late as about, by 1848, 1849, to try and get cotton growing going in what will become Queensland. Didn't work too well. These experiments were very limited. We got 1 or 2 prizes when they sent some back to England, but it didn't really take off. And then in the 1860s, at the time of the American Civil War, there was a much stronger effort to try and get cotton growing going. And as you know, as you go down to the Gold Coast Road, you'll still see Cotton Company Road just near Beenleigh as part of that experiment. Didn't work too well. Markets keep changing, as anyone on the land knows. But it was the tropical agriculture growing sugar that became the first successful effort to use the land intensively in a farming capacity. And then as technology keeps changing, by the 1890s, when you look at the end of Diane's exhibition, how the government is now beginning to resume at least or half of the big properties to make them available for these small farmers who are a much higher form of living. By that stage, most of the big pastoralists or squatters were quite willing to lose a lot of their land because land had become rather expensive. By this stage, they were improving it in various ways, putting in fences so you didn't need as much labour, putting in dams so you could use the land more intensively. And at the same time, you have a farming community beginning to arise as the big pastoral runs get broken down. And at the same time, the squatter or the pastoralist knows that when shearing time comes, he can get the labour out of the farmer who wants a bit of extra cash, because it's a bloody hard job working as a farmer in the 1890s or the early 1900s. Look at Dad and Dave. That's your opposition, is Sir Arthur or Arthur Hodgson here, and Dad and Dave by the 1890s, the early 1900s.
And
Kate, apropos of breaking up the properties, there is a timeline for some of these historic properties. We were talking about Eden Vale, which was the Hodgson property, which, Diane, correct me if I'm wrong, part of the Eden Vale, because Ramsays were involved in assisting to manage it, it became Harrow.
Yes.
Part of it became Harrow.
Yeah.
Then from there, Lauderdale Ramsay took, I think, 1,200 acres from Harrow, which was his family brother's property, I think, to form Bankery. He then formed a stud, a very, very profitable and very successful thoroughbred stud. His purple and white colours were seen to great advantage all over the southeast area of racehorses. Bankery, interestingly enough, the stud groom on Bankery, and we're talking we're getting into the sort of 1900s. The stud groom on Bankery was a man called Andy McAlpine. Andy moved across the road, subsequently took up land and named his property Eureka. Eureka is still operating today with the third generation, one of our most prominent thoroughbred studs and most successful thoroughbred studs which came through. Bankery is now owned by Mary Lee Trivett and her husband Rick. Some of you may remember Rick as when his university days and yes, as one of the finest football players around.
I was at college.
Excellent, yeah. And Mary Lee was the first woman ever to be elected to the board after 147 years to the Queensland Turf Club board. They now run Bankery. The McAlpine family, Scott and Grania, are the third generation running Eureka. Canning Downs, of course, still thrives with the fourth generation of John Barnes. Lyndhurst Stud, which was started in the late 1800s, the Gore family owned it first. It then went to the McDougalls. The McDougalls set up a most successful thoroughbred stud with Lyndhurst. Lyndhurst is still flourishing now under the care of the Krugers. Wattlebray stud, very, very successful. Fourth generation of the Turkington family. The original father came from Ulster and selected his property as part of Pilton Station. So there's a wonderful timeline that really I think is important because it links that history to show that there is a continuity, there is a sustainability right throughout that particular aspect of
And I
horse
guess
history.
there are many of them, and that would be, this in a way is getting us to thinking about the white glove section of the night, because given what Ross was saying about the changes, particularly by the 1890s, then one of the labour record books over there starts in, I think, about 1907 or 1908, and that's when you can see the labourer who is a ringbarker, the horseboy, the itinerant labourers, and they're all listed there. And of course, one of the books over there starts in 1909, and it goes for a couple of decades, which means, of course, you can you can keep turning those pages and see what happens. 1914, 1915, what's happening? Are the names changing? You know, what other histories are we getting by looking at what are ostensibly labour records? And of course, there's an awful lot of other stuff that we're going to find in this collection fermenting at the same time. 1890s, a little bit of industrial unrest perhaps. Some of those workers aren't, want to change things. So this is actually, I mean, we could obviously sit here and talk all night, but I wonder if there are more contributions or questions from you on the floor that you'd like to add. And if not, then it's also a good opportunity to come and have a look at some of this material and to draw on the expertise of our speakers here, and there are also other specialist librarians around too. But I can see that there's a question. I think there are two questions here. Down the front.
I noticed in the Moreton Bay Courier in the 1850s...
Sorry, would you mind just waiting so that we can make sure everybody at the back can hear you?
I noticed in the Moreton Bay Courier of the 1850s the Drayton Races were being advertised in Brisbane. How early in the piece did Drayton become the centre of competitive racing?
Told you I'd need these notes, didn't I? I do have a date.
And
believe
there's a
it or
young woman
not.
behind you who's got a question too.
Yeah. Drayton was from 1848 with a panel of stewards that read like a who's who of the squadocracy of the district. They raced very successfully there. Probably one of the most prominent owners at that stage in that area was John Finney. If you know Drayton, you'll know the notorious Finney rail crossing just outside Drayton. He actually had a mail run, and he then developed his Rosevale stud. But Drayton was very, very successful. It was the forerunner of the Toowoomba Turf Club, which was established much later. So on those dates, you had, and their prize money far overshadowed anything that you had in Brisbane. Ipswich was actually better than Brisbane at that point. But you had Drayton in 1848, you had Warwick 1851, Condamine 1859, and the North Australian Jockey Club, which was at Ipswich, which openly vied with Brisbane, as Ross will tell you, as the principal town in the colony.
The Darling Downs
was
sponsored Ipswich.
Yes.
They didn't like Brisbane, and in fact, at one stage, the Darling Downs squatters wanted. Well, they brought their stuff down by dray or by bullock or whatever to Ipswich, and then they wanted to get it out through a new port at Cleveland, until that proved unsuccessful, and to try and bypass Brisbane. And remember too, when railways started in Queensland, they started from Ipswich to the Darling Downs, not from Brisbane.
I sense an exhibition about Ipswich coming up. Now we have a question in the second row as well.
Hi. I was just wondering, I noticed in the exhibition there's a lot about the English Botanic Gardens and how a lot of the English gardens were in style because they were planting those types and wanted that sense of home. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, so it's not exactly on the topic of horses, but still the English gardens and who was tending them and that kind of history.
Well, I think one of the wonderful things, as I said in the exhibition, in the little tour, was the Tulgai Garden book, and that really says a lot about how they saw the land and what they wanted to do with their home areas, their home paddocks or their home gardens surrounding those things. And one of the things that I find so poignant about the fact that, which you were saying before, this whole period just lasted for about 50 years. But if you go out there today, and there are some properties that are still inhabited, but there are many more that have burnt down or disappeared or carted away over the years. And in some cases you can still see, you still know where it is because of the remnant gardens or the remnant plants that are there. Like the Neaton Vale, there's a few jacarandas, the imported jacarandas from South America that still dot the property. And that's true of other plants on Clifton and a variety of other properties like that. So the gardens not only were there for them, but they tell us a lot today still about what they were like.
Didn't one of them get stuff from Kew?
Oh yes, they got them from Kew. And of course Marion North, the famous botanical artist, came out here and stayed at Goombera. She witnessed a bushfire during her stay, and she writes about it in her reminiscences of her life. And she did some works on the property, as she did in the Brisbane Botanical Gardens too.
And remember, there was the Queensland Acclimatisation Society. It was very busy from the 1860s on trying to figure out those introduced plants that would succeed here. But at least the Clarks of East Talgai loved Australian native fauna, because that picture there is part of the Bunya walk. They decided that the bunyas were something to be saved and respected. Yeah. But most of the gardeners wanted to think of home. England or Scotland or wherever was home, and so they were trying to create English-style gardens, and the acceptance of native plants like native animals or native peoples was a little bit slow in coming.
But one really interesting thing, though, is if you look in the Moreton Bay Courier at the time, in the 1850s, there are advertisements for Bunya Seeds. So the nurserymen in Sydney were supplying them to the gardeners up here. So there was a sense that these ground plants should be available and should be utilised.
Diane, with Glengallen now, with the restoration, the plants that they've planted there, have they tried to copy?
They have. They're doing the garden is an ongoing project, I understand. Yeah. And I was only up there a couple of years ago, so we took some photographs that we used in the little display there. And they're seeking to recreate. Yes, they have, and the box hedges and things of that kind around that circular driveway. Yes, they are trying to recreate that, but there are very few photos, and I think there are a couple that we have in the show are probably the only ones that actually show the gardens of Glengallen in their height. But some of the others were just enormously grand, and the irrigation that was required and the infrastructure to service them is just astounding. The Gores at Yandilla was an unbelievable garden that was, one of the greatest of its type at the time.
And I'll just leap in, just before your question, and say if you're interested in the broader history of botanic gardens in Australia, and there's a Gardening History Association, there's lots of fantastic academic work, but I'll just put in a plug. On ABC Radio National this week, I just happen to know, there was a special feature done on the history of botanic gardens, and it's on the front page of Radio National, and it was an Occam's razor, and it's there as a little online feature. I just happened to see it today by pure chance. I promise she's not a plant. I've never met this young woman before. But yeah, it's on Radio National's front page. And sorry, another question.
Yeah, my comments and question all tie Marianne North into the horse topic that we're discussing tonight. In the book that Diane referred to, she makes some observations about her time on a property near Dalby, and she talks about the Aboriginal people who were living there and how they were very good with the children and how they were blatant thieves and they didn't mind going off on their own every now and then, but she said they were wonderful with the horses and the way they managed the horses, and they used the voice, and they seemed to understand the language of the horses much better than the whites.
We talked about this, didn't we?
And I wondered if you'd like to, if you can add anything to that, or what your response to it would be.
A great history of the Aboriginal stockmen, isn't there, Ross?
Yeah, we have no answer to that, but we keep saying this is something that you, Mary, could look into. There's a lot of work that a lot of people can do. We don't only collect resources here and information, we really encourage people to go out and begin doing some of this research because it's infinite.
And the horses would have been, in those very early days, foreign to them because there wouldn't have been any natural.
But we know very quickly, especially one or two studies in North Queensland, not for the Darling Downs. The Aborigines are pretty silent on the Darling Downs. They got written out very, very early. There were a few fracas, but other than that, we know very little. Although I was looking at that Eliza Hodgson drawing, and I think two of the the Fairholme. The Fairholme drawing in there's a watercolour. To me, I think two of the people may be Aboriginal people doing droving, which one would expect. But in the north, very early, the Aboriginals come in very early as stock assistants for cattle. I mean, cattle does make a difference in Queensland. We haven't talked of cattle because the Darling Downs is very much a sheep area. But by 1880, Queensland has already become the cattle colony, and especially up north and out west. And by that stage, we already see Aboriginal stockmen being heavily involved and, in fact, making the whole northern pastoral industry possible because they were very cheap labour. And without that, we would not have occupied the north.
And can I just add that there's a really interesting diary that I've read here in the John Oxley Library collection from a woman, an English woman who came to Australia in the 1880s. And it's a very elaborate diary. It starts out as a shipboard diary. And then as a wealthy woman travelling through Queensland, she's travelling from station to station. And it's clearly she's staying as a sort of paid guest. And what's interesting is how often part of the sort of entertainment was that they would go down to the associated Aboriginal camp. And so as you read this diary, you're actually struck by the presence of Aboriginal people in the story, not their absence, because they're there as domestic workers, they're there as labourers, and it seemed to be an acknowledged part of, and she's travelling all through Queensland. Her name was, I think, Alice Haber Percy, and it's a really interesting diary, and it's also sort of quite confronting because at various points she's, jollily going along and then, she's shooting all these animals and stuffing them and sending them home to England. So it sort of confronts your ideas about English womanhood as well. But I was really struck by how present Aboriginal people were in all of these stories.
May I just say something else quickly? The John Watts memoir, I don't know, is it out tonight?
No, it's not. It's not.
No, this is a memoir. John Watts, of course, one of the people in the exhibition, and he wrote this memoir many years after he'd gone back to England. But he makes this comment about the Aboriginal people and how he's sure that it was never intended that these people would have a sole occupancy of the land because they were doing absolutely nothing with it other than killing the animals when they needed them, and no appreciation that those beautiful plains that Alan Cunningham discovered had been husbanded by the Aboriginal people. And I just always find it very exciting when you find an original source like that expresses an attitude.
And Mary, also on your point, it's not in the exhibition because Diane had to cut out a lot of stuff, but there is a marvellous photo in the Glengallen collection of this Aboriginal man. He looks to be in a jockey's outfit.
Oh, that's Hodgson, but it's
Hodgson.
from Eatonvale, yes.
Oh, at Eatonvale, yeah.
He was known as Hodgson, obviously, for obvious reasons, but he was because the thing that the necklace tells you about is when I was doing the research on the necklace, one of the things that I discovered was that Watts was he was the president of the Darling Downs Jockey Club, wasn't it, at that point in the 1860s? Yes. He was president of that, but each year at Eatonvale, after harvest, they would have a big race event in front of the house, a racetrack, and they would race all day, and it was a big social event with celebrations and dinner and all of those things. It was very much part of their life.
But he does look to be in jockey outfit,
he is.
Don't you think? So he probably, they took the horses very, very quickly.
And there's no doubt that they enjoyed the racing in the early days because here in Brisbane they used to race on an improvised course around the area where it's now the Hamilton Hotel. And they used to give the Aboriginals blankets and they used to sit up in the trees and watch the horse racing. And apparently they used to ride on occasions as well. So, there always was that affinity, I think.
I love the fact that Helen can obviously look at a present landscape and sees racetracks and horses and stables in the way that I guess we all have different ways of looking at these historical landscapes.
Well, we were talking before too, when Alan Cunningham left on his trip to the Darling Downs in 1827, yes, he left from Sedgenhoe, which was a small village just outside Scone in the Hunter Valley, which of course was the principal thoroughbred breeding area. Sedgenhoe then lent its name, and we were not sure where the name came from, to one of the most prominent thoroughbred studs in the Hunter Valley and indeed in Australia. And in recent years, Sedgenhoe has had a fabulous, well, not recent years, but generations of Sedgenhoe have bred some of the finest horses in the country, and only recently has had its name changed to Vinery because of the American owner. But once again, you've got that link with history. Cunningham packing his gear, leaving from Sedgenhoe to come up to the Downs to discover all these pastures that you were talking about and the fabulous country that he compared, and I think later on, as being the equivalent, or if not better, for horse breeding and horse rearing than, say, the Hunter Valley, although I think the New South Wales people would probably continue to dispute that. And then returning to Sedgenhoe 12 days later. So once again, you've got that connection with that timeline.
I'm also smiling because I think you were worried that you didn't have some of the dates and names straight. I think that we're doing fine here. Now, there's another question or comment here.
Yeah, this is a question for Ross. Are you familiar with the Harold Hall collection in Dalby?
No.
Harold Hall, who was a draftsman by trade, made it his sort of like life's passion to document Aboriginal sort of like history on the Darling Downs, well, within the sort of like 50-mile radius of Dalby. And he's got detailed documentation, exquisite drawings of campsites, etc. And most of the artefacts have actually been now donated to the Dalby Museum. However, they're not interested in his documentation, which is actually under threat. So, it is actually sort of like quite voluminous.
And are there illustrations as well?
His illustrations, because he was a draftsman, are absolutely exquisite.
Because my exhibition next year is going to be on Oscar Fristrom, who was a Swedish painter who did a stack of Aboriginal paintings and portraits from 1887 through to 1916. But I want to do a prelude to it on early Aboriginal faces or people being represented by different times. So I will have to make a trip to Dalby, won't I?
Is this your collection? Are you a local
Well,
librarian?
we're currently trying to procure funds to actually do an assessment of the collection. Well, mainly with the documentation, because the Dalby Museum has acquired, as I said, most of the artefacts, but they're also not in a position to actually acquire the documentation because they don't have the environmental conditions to care for it. Yeah.
Sorry, but are you from the Dalby Library or the museum?
Oh, no, I'm independent consultant, so
right.
Yes.
And because the reason I asked is that I was lucky enough to be at a recent session at the Australian Libraries conference about what they call the distributed collection of Queensland memory, and it just gave me this sense of all of these small museums and libraries and historical associations, and so what's held here is only one part of what we need to think about when we think about that wider sense of history, but also it means there has to be advocacy, doesn't there?
Oh, most definitely, because a part of this collection as well is that Tyndale, it informed Tyndale's research because there is a letter from Tyndale acknowledging, thanks to Harold Hall himself for providing the information.
Can I ask you to communicate with Diane? So I'm not officially part of the library. I'm only a volunteer doing this as a dabbling dilettante, I call it, in my retirement, so I don't get Alzheimer's. But Diane, I'm sure, would be very, very interested. I'm interested too. I'll be going up there, but I think for library purposes,
Yes, I can give you my email address and we can just have a correspondence. I can pass it on to the relevant people anyway.
Well, this actually might be a good time for us to do the informal or the less formal part of the evening, which is to come and have a look at some of these materials and think about all those wonderful research projects that you're all about to kick off for the questions you wanted to ask, the other stories that you want to know about, because there really is an extraordinary amount of stuff here in the JOL. Now, you will see that there are white gloves there, and that we really don't want you to throw red wine over any of this material. That would be a bit hard to explain. And again, do ask Diane and Helen and Ross if they can, help illuminate some of these things, or you as specialists or, interested parties yourself might see things that the rest of us don't see. And so across the 3 lots of tables here, there's all sorts of stuff. And I challenge you not to find something that you're going to be interested in. There's a savings book there for a woman who was a widow in the 1880s. That was her occupation widow. And just reading through how much money she put in and how much she took out, I just thought there's a story there. Her name's Elizabeth. Maybe somebody can tell me more about her. So could you please thank our specialist panellists for the night?